Good evening, Stigmadeign. This is in part a reply to your video response to episode 28 of my Literally Genesis series, as well as the text comments that you left on that video. Now, my understanding from watching your work and talking to other people is that you fancy yourself as a bit of a Christian apologist. So, when I saw that you were going to pawn me, I was quite looking forward to hearing what insights you would be bringing to the discussion. And I was excited to find out just what glaring error I had missed that would get my arse owned. That's no joke, or me being sarcastic, it's true. But your video response when it did arrive was not quite what I expected. From your text comment, I was expecting to be schooled as to why a change in the narrative was decided upon, but in the end you made a video about the meaning of the word lighted and what the author was talking about when Jacob used a rock as a pillar. I was really quite confused why you would be doing this, but I stuck with it, and then you explained the meaning of the chapter. That it was all about Jacob putting his trust in the Lord, and the Lord promising to support him, which left me even more confused about the dictionary definitions that you gave for the two terms, and exactly which chapter of Genesis you had been reading. Now, you do realize that the Literally Genesis series is satire, where I am extracting the Michael from the original text, rather than trying to rationalize it or interpret it. I show the original text so that the viewer can see the joke. Creating the series is actually quite a lot more difficult than I think that you realize, as I don't just sit down and edit an electronic copy of the Bible, adding dirty jokes and lewd comments at random. As anyone who has written comedy will tell you, in order to satirize something, you need to be able to understand it first, and that is where the legwork comes in. Before I get started, I have to sit down and find out exactly what message the text is supposed to be conveying, not just from Christian commentators such as Matthew Henry, Adam Clark, and Albert Barnes, to name just a couple, but also from the various Jewish and Islamic commentators, because, and you may be surprised to hear this, but in many cases the three versions of the same story used by all three major Abrahamic religions are subtly different, and in some cases entirely contradictory, even though they are all based on the same original writings and the same alleged story. It is because I have to do all of this research that I do not write each episode separately. They are written in story arcs, with several chapters being edited all at once so that the narrative that I am adding flows between episodes, but also that I do not contradict myself or run myself into a dead end and end up getting pwned by the source material a couple of chapters later. It is a method that the original authors of Genesis could have benefited from using. So, in short, yes, I am well aware of the underlying meaning of the chapter. There is a massive continuity mistake between Genesis 27 and Genesis 28, with Genesis 27 being all about Jacob's little deception of Isaac, and yet just one chapter later, it isn't mentioned at all. In fact, the summary of the events of Genesis 27 at the beginning of Genesis 28 turned this story completely on its head, saying that Isaac intentionally blessed Jacob, and that Isaac then sent Jacob to Haran to find a wife, rather than, as is stated in chapter 27, that his mother sent him to Haran to hide from Esau. Literally Genesis is all about reading Genesis literally, at face value without any contorted and convoluted explanations. And what we see is that one chapter states one thing, and the immediately following chapter states the complete opposite. The events of Genesis 27 are really important, and the fact that Esau was fucked over by Jacob is a seriously major plot point that runs through quite a few of the remaining chapters, and changing these events with roles and motivations being reversed has massive implications on up-and-coming chapters, because it sets out a reason for the conflict between Jacob and his brother. That is, of course, if any of it is to be taken literally. Which, of course, is the whole point of the series. We so often hear Christians talking about the literal truth of the Bible. The likes of Kent Hovind like to proclaim that they believe every word of the Bible to be accurate and true. Ken Ham, the guy who runs Answers in Genesis, and so would be expected to be aware of the continuity error we are talking about, gets up in front of impressionable children and tells them that if it is in the Bible, then it's true. But when it comes to Genesis 27 and 28, which version is true? Because both versions are in the Bible, and if what Ken Ham says is correct, then what you have is a paradox. I was really hoping that you were going to untangle that paradox and make some sense of it for both me and the rest of us, but all you did was clarify the definition of a couple of random words and tell me that the Lord made a deal with Jacob, which I already knew about. My commentary for the latter half of the episode is all about that deal and how it makes the old my wife and sister scam look like amateur hour. Let's look at that deal in a little more detail. First, there is the bit that Jacob imagined, where the Lord offers to give him a patch of land. It's not entirely apparent what is going on here, but if you read it carefully, you will see the problem. You see, if you work out where Jacob was, you will see that it is just north of Jerusalem, and slap bang right in the middle of the bit of land that the Lord gave Jacob's grandfather several times before during the previous chapters. First, just as a gift, then in return for a continuous supply of foreskins, and then in return for Abraham's sacrificing Isaac. It is the piece of land that, in verse 4 of Genesis 28, Isaac grants to Jacob as part of his blessing, as it was granted to Isaac by Abraham. So you see, Jacob already owned the piece of land that he imagined that the Lord was offering him, so it would have been impossible for the Lord to follow through on this promise. So, it's just as well that it was a figment of Jacob's imagination then. It might be in the Bible, but in the literal setting of the story, it is about as real as the entire 8th season of Dallas, which was entirely imagined by Pamela Ewing while Bobby was having a shit shave in a shower. Of course, we then have Jacob's vow, which is a masterpiece of smoke and mirrors, and makes his father and grandfather's wife-swapping antics with the neighbours look, well, childish. Basically, what he proposes is that he will give back to the Lord 10% of everything that the Lord gives him. Now, of course, anyone with any common sense will realize that in reality he is talking to his shadow, and what he means is that he will give 10% of everything he receives from real people to a figment of his imagination. But he does not say that. If you read it literally, then in his vow he is demanding that the Lord provides everything that he needs, with the offer that he will give some of it back in return. He will then allow the Lord to be his God. Now, if you don't see why this is all a scam, then please send me $100 and I will give you a 10% cut in everything I receive from you. If you don't think it's worth it for just $10, then why not send me 1,000? And I will send you $100 instead. Hell, why not give me your house and I will give you a 10% share of it? Remember, the more that you send, the more you get back in return. Just don't complain when I end up with everything that you want. However, more importantly, you entirely miss the point of the vow. And that is that what Jacob has done is that he has invented tithing, where people give 10% of their income to the church. Personally, I think that tithing is an optional tax on the gullible, but then again, that's just me. Anyway, if we are going to be analytical, there is also the language that is used. Not for the first time, the Lord is referred to as the God of Abraham and Isaac. Only this time, in Jacob's dream sequence, it is the Lord who is using this terminology to describe himself. Surely, if we are to read all of this literally, the Lord would just refer to himself as God. As after all, he could hardly refer to himself as the God of Abraham before Abraham was born. So if the Lord is now describing himself in a way that indicates that there could be other gods, then where did the other gods come from. And finally, let's look at what Genesis 28 is all about. Genesis 28 is just as much about the ladder as it is about the vow, but you don't mention the ladder at all. It's argued that the ladder with its angels represent the various exiles of the Israelites, although this is one of those things that you would need to read the Jewish Midrash, which looks at this in great detail, if you want to know more. But there are other things in there. As mentioned earlier, it also introduces tithing, but more importantly, it also introduces the concept of worshipping inanimate objects for the first time in the story. I am guessing that you read a brief synopsis about the chapter, and it went a bit over your head, because you almost got this one, but then you fumbled it. Yes, it's the stone pillar. Previously, Abraham and those before him have erected altars, which they have burnt things on. But an altar is simply something which is used to make an offering on. It isn't something that is revered or worshipped. By setting the stone as a pillar and anointing it with oil, Jacob was declaring that the stone was a sacred stone, or what was called a Bethel, which I believe is translated directly as House of God. The place was named after the stone, as it says in the text, and eventually went on to be a major cultic centre for the region, where people worshipped, of all things, a golden calf. Now, I wonder where they got the notion that cows were pleasing to the Lord. But then again, Bethel wasn't alone in having a sacred stone, as worshipping sacred stones was quite common in the region at the time. Strangely enough, it was all very much like the old pagan belief that gods, fairies, and other ethereal creatures lived in rocks and boulders, and my comparison of the stone pillar to a toadstool was not accidental, for a number of reasons, but that's a video all by itself, so I'm going to let you work that one out for yourself. Of course, I'm not going to let you entirely off the hook regarding the stone pillar, because you brought it up in your ownage video. So, considering what I have just told you, and presuming that, as a Christian apologist, you have an excellent understanding of Scripture, I will leave you with this question. How does Jacob, creating a Bethel, a sacred stone that is to be worshipped as an object containing the essence of the Lord, grant favour with the Lord in light of the second commandment? As a Christian apologist, you should have no problems at all with answering all of these questions and explaining all the inconsistencies that I have brought up here. After all, this is stuff that, by your own words, a third grader can understand. I am guessing that is mainly because a third grader hasn't yet learnt critical thinking skills, and it all sounds entirely plausible. But hey, who doesn't like the notion of a magical old man who takes notice of who has been good and naughty, and then hands out rewards accordingly? I, of course, look forward to hearing your explanation.